Hey, what's up, everyone? This week we're going to be reading the end of First Chronicles and to chapter 16 in Second Chronicles, as well as continuing on in Psalm 119. But for this video, I want to focus in just on the Chronicles passages that we'll be looking at this week. Before I get to a couple things specifically on what we're looking at, just a reminder that First and Second Chronicles is really one book that is communicating Israel's history. So as you're reading it, this is a person who is writing down the history of a nation, the history of a people. And the specific aim, as Daniel mentioned last week, is that they would highlight the king from David's line, this promise that God has made to David. The ESV Study Bible says that the central theme of Chronicles is the significance of David's covenant as the enduring basis of life and hope for Israel. So really the book is centered on this covenant that God has made with David, that he would have an everlasting king that would rule and reign over God's people. Now, as that is kind of the backdrop, there's kind of three movements through Chronicles, and we're actually going to dip into all of them throughout this week. So let me just highlight those three for you this week. The first one is what they call the United Kingdom, and that's under David and Solomon. So we are wrapping up David's life, and we're going to look in Second Chronicles at Solomon's life and his kingship. And what those stories are really highlighting is this kind of the best times in Israel's history as a kingdom. And so it's called the United Kingdom. It's when all the tribes are together under one king. And this part of the book really does highlight for us the beauty and the majesty of what God's kingdom should look like. And even though these kings weren't perfect, they did rule over a pretty prosperous kingdom in different parts for each of them. But as you're reading this, just think through elements of God's kingdom, the elements that translate from what Israel had back then to just the everlasting aspects of God's kingdom. So as you're reading through, especially through Solomon, just be noticing different traits of the kingdom and what kingdom life is like for Israel. So the first section in Chronicles is really about the United Kingdom. The second section, and this is a little bit more kind of, it's weaved throughout a little bit, but one of the other main movements that we need to notice is movements around the temple. So David wanted to build a temple. God said, no, your son's going to do it. And so we're going to see the building of the temple. And really this kind of culminates in Second Chronicles 7. So when you get to that part this week in your reading, really take a moment to kind of meditate on this idea of a temple. You see, for Israel, the temple was set up as a place of worship and the presence of God. I mean, that was kind of the centerpiece, the fulcrum, or the nut of God's presence in his kingdom. It all resides in the temple. If we have this beautiful kingdom that Israel's living out of during Solomon's reign, the core of that kingdom is the temple, because at the core of the temple is the presence of God. So we're going to see the beauty of this temple and Solomon dedicating this temple, and you'll read through that. And while that's majestic, we know that temple actually was torn down. And then they built a second one, and that temple didn't last, and it wasn't as good as the first one. And so as you're reading through this, see the majesty of the temple, but allow your mind to kind of meditate and just kind of leap forward a little bit to the true temple. You know, Jesus in the Gospel of John is called the temple of God. There's imagery that he gives, and he uses the illustration that he himself, his body, is the temple of God. So as good as this temple is for the kingdom of God in Israel, it's nothing like the true temple. Jesus himself, as he comes, and he is the centerpiece of our faith. He's not just a building that's the center, but he's a person, and he is the place of worship and the presence of God, just like the temple was meant to be back then. That's what Jesus is for Christianity, for us. He's the centerpiece of the kingdom of God. It's no longer a building or a nation or anything geographical. The centerpiece of the kingdom of God is Jesus himself. And so as you're reading through the stuff on the temple, just let your mind to kind of go there and just maybe in praise and worship that we don't necessarily have a building anymore. We have a person, and he is Jesus, and he leads us as a people of the kingdom to worship in the presence of God. Third movement that we'll see, and we're just going to start this, but this actually will go through the end of Chronicles, is the kings from David's line in the divided kingdom. So you'll hear about how the kingdom is no longer united, but it's divided into Israel and Judah. And we're going to start to see the stories of kings from David's line. Now remember, the main emphasis of Chronicles is that there would be a king from David's line ruling and reigning forever. So if we have a kingdom, and the centerpiece of the kingdom is the temple, there's also supposed to be this king that is leading God's people to the worship of God, into the presence of God, as a whole nation and as a people. And what you're going to find in Chronicles is that none of these kings, even though they're good and they're painted in good light oftentimes, they're not the true king, and each of them dies. And so you should, as you're reading this, think of the covenant that God made to David, that there would be an everlasting king. And every time you read a story about a king who does some good things and then he dies, it should be a little bit of a disappointment, a little bit of, okay, it's not him. And then the next king rises up, and then he dies, and it's not him. And that should be leading us toward, in a week or so, when we get to go to Matthew and we hear about a king that will never stay dead, even though he does die on a cross. He rises again, and he's an eternal king, Jesus himself, who's not only the king, but he is the temple, and he is building an even better kingdom. And so as you're reading through Chronicles this week, just allow yourselves in those themes of kingdom and temple and king, just allow yourselves to kind of move toward the fulfillment of those in Jesus. And I think as you do that, it'll really allow some of these stories to pop in, and you'll kind of feel this longing, as Israel did, for a greater kingdom, a greater temple, and a greater king. And that's what we find in Jesus. So I hope that helps as you kind of read through Chronicles this week. Enjoy, and let us know if you have any questions.